Gabriel's alarm always rang before the sun had time to rise. The digital numbers flickered 4:45 a.m. in cold red light. For most, this was the dead of night. But for Gabriel, it was already late. His body responded automatically, his feet finding the floor, his hands reaching for the same faded shirt hanging at the edge of the bed. Maria, his wife, lay curled under the blanket, her breathing soft but tired. She had returned from her hospital shift just 2 hours earlier. Gabriel paused for a moment to watch her sleep. There was something sacred in those quiet seconds. It was the only time the world seemed still, the only moment where he could forget the bills on the kitchen table, the cracked ceiling above their bed, or the aching emptiness in their fridge. He walked softly to the kitchen, careful not to let the floor creak. Their apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a hallway that doubled as a storage space. The walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments, but not enough to keep out the winter drafts. Gabriel turned on the kettle and stared at the peeling wallpaper. The coffee jar was nearly empty. He measured out 1 small scoop and saved the rest for Maria. Outside, the city was still half asleep. The streets carried the echoes of early delivery trucks and the rare passing bus. Gabriel wrapped himself in his jacket, worn at the sleeves and torn near the collar, and stepped into the cold. He worked construction, 10-hour shifts under steel beams and dust clouds. It was brutal work, but steady. He was known on site as the quiet one. Never complained, never stopped. He carried more than just bricks and tools. He carried the quiet desperation of a man trying to provide without falling apart. Maria always told him he was too silent, too proud. But what could he say? That every night he counted the coins in his pocket, hoping they'd stretch far enough for groceries? That he skipped lunch more often than not just so she could eat dinner? They hadn't had a vacation in years. Their dates were now walks through discount stores or shared sandwiches in the park. And yet, Gabriel never resented it. Love, he believed, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about staying when it was hard, about showing up every day with what little you had. That evening, Maria came home with her hands raw and red. "Double shift again," she whispered, collapsing onto the couch. Gabriel knelt to remove her shoes. Didn't they say they'd hire someone else? They did, but she quit, couldn't handle it. You shouldn't be doing 2 people's jobs. Maria leaned her head back, eyes closed. Neither should you. They laughed quietly. It was the kind of laughter that carried both love and exhaustion, like a flickering candle refusing to go out. Later that night, Gabriel sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a letter from a utility company. 1 more missed payment, and they'd cut the power. He pressed his forehead against the table and breathed deeply. They were drowning slowly, day by day, and no one seemed to notice. But Gabriel noticed. He saw it in Maria's thinning face, in her fading smile. He felt it in his own bones, how they ached before sunrise and again long after sunset. And still, he kept moving, because if he stopped, he didn't know what would be left. He didn't tell Maria about the warning letter. He folded it carefully, slipped it behind the spice rack, and whispered a silent prayer. Not out loud, not even a God by name, just a fragile hope that tomorrow might be gentler. Gabriel rose early the next morning, the same way he had for years. No alarm, just the internal rhythm of a man burdened by responsibility. The light leaking through the cracked blinds fell on the chipped coffee table, where a pile of unpaid bills sat like a silent jury, judging him. Maria was still asleep in their modest bedroom, her hand clutching a threadbare blanket pulled up to her chin. Gabriel stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her peaceful face and wondering how long it had been since she truly rested, without worry tugging at the corners of her dreams. The kitchen was cold, and the flickering light above the stove reminded him that repairs were overdue. He boiled water for instant coffee, the only luxury they could still afford on most days. As he sipped from the same chipped mug he'd used for years, he stared out the small window at the gray skyline of their aging neighborhood. Concrete buildings, rusted balconies, graffiti-stained walls. Nothing had changed. It was a place where dreams came to retire, and Gabriel had once vowed to be different, to escape the gravity of poverty. But gravity has a cruel way of pulling harder on the hopeful. His job at the steelworks was a brutal one, but it paid just enough to keep him afloat. Barely. He worked double shifts when they were available, even triple when desperation outweighed exhaustion. The supervisors liked him because he never complained, but they never promoted him either. He was invisible in a system that chewed through men like gears in a forgotten machine. That morning, Gabriel took an extra few minutes to walk to work, taking a different route past the old chapel on the corner. It had been boarded up for years, but he remembered attending services there with his mother when he was just a boy. He stopped, let his fingers graze the flake of the doorframe, and whispered a quiet prayer, not out loud, but in the hidden corner of his mind where faith still flickered. It wasn't even a full sentence, just a word, help. By the time he arrived at the factory, the sky had darkened with heavy clouds, and the air smelled of metal and storm. Inside, the deafening noise of machines filled the space as always, drowning out every human sound. Gabriel took his position and worked as though the world outside didn't exist. Hours passed in a blur of heat, sweat, and repetition. But that day was different. During his lunch break, his manager, a thick-necked man named Ronan, called him into the small office upstairs. Papers were scattered across the desk, and the room smelled of old coffee and newer stress. "Sit down, Gabriel," Ronan said, not making eye contact. Gabriel obeyed, heart tightening. "I've got to ask you something serious," Ronan said, thumbing through a file. "There's a discrepancy in some of the materials from last week's shipment. High-value steel is missing, enough to raise suspicion." Gabriel blinked, confused. "Sir, I haven't touched anything I wasn't supposed to. You know I clock in early, stay late. I don't even talk to the others most days." "I know that," Ronan said, finally looking up. "But the logs show your access card was used on Saturday night." "I wasn't even here Saturday," Gabriel said, a sick feeling blooming in his chest. "I was home with Maria." "There's no camera footage." "The system was down," Ronan replied. "But until we sort this out, corporate wants you suspended, with no pay." The world seemed to tilt under Gabriel's feet. It was the kind of accusation that stained everything it touched, whether it was true or not. He tried to explain, begged Ronan to look deeper, but the man's eyes were already elsewhere. Gabriel left the office with his jaw clenched and his heart racing. That night, he broke down in front of Maria for the first time in years. They sat on their worn couch in the dim glow of the kitchen bulb. "They think I stole from them," he said, voice cracking. "Me, after everything I've given them." Maria placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "We know the truth. That's what matters." But truth doesn't always pay the rent. As the days passed, bills continued arriving, food grew scarce, and job prospects shrank. People in the neighborhood began whispering. Old friends stopped returning his calls. Even his landlord grew colder. Gabriel spent his mornings scouring job boards and his nights sitting on the roof, looking up at a sky that no longer seemed to listen. He prayed again, this time aloud, words spilling from a man at the edge of desperation. "Lord, if you're real, if you're still watching, I need you now." But the sky offered no answer, only silence. The next morning arrived without fanfare, just the slow, creeping light of dawn casting golden streaks across the Gabriel and Maria's worn-out curtains. Gabriel sat at the small kitchen table, hunched over the last 2 slices of dry bread. Maria, already dressed, gently placed a chipped mug of tea before him. "I'll try to bring more eggs today," she whispered, brushing a hand over his shoulder. Gabriel looked up and forced a smile, one that didn't reach his tired eyes. "Be careful," he said softly, "and don't push yourself too hard." Maria worked at a nearby sewing cooperative, stitching patterns for local vendors, while Gabriel spent most of his time bouncing between odd repair jobs, leaky pipes, broken tiles, busted radiators. He was known as a quiet man who showed up on time and asked for little. But the work was inconsistent, and each week they seemed to fall further behind. Rent, food, heating, all pressing down like invisible hands around his throat. That afternoon, Gabriel was walking back from a job repairing a broken door hinge in a nearby apartment when he passed by an alley near the market square. A young boy, no older than 12, was crouched by the wall, his arms clutching a bag of bread to his chest. 2 older teens towered over him, shouting and reaching for the bag. Something inside Gabriel snapped. He stepped in without thinking, pushing one of the boys aside and standing between them and the child. The teen spat insults and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Gabriel rattled but relieved. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide. "Thank you," he murmured. Gabriel didn't answer. He just nodded and walked away. By the time he got home, the clouds had thickened and a soft rain began to fall. Maria sat by the window, looking anxious. "You're late," she said, standing to meet him. Gabriel told her what happened, brushing off the details, but Maria sensed a heaviness in his tone. "You always carry the weight of the world," she whispered, kissing his temple. Later that night, Gabriel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by a strange sense of unease. The incident in the alley played on repeat in his mind. There was something in the way those boys had looked at him, something bitter, vengeful. He tried to shake it off. "You did the right thing," he told himself. But fear was a subtle thief. It crept in during the quiet moments, poisoning peace with shadow. Days passed, and though Gabriel tried to resume a sense of normalcy, something fell off. One evening, as he returned from fixing a burst pipe in the outer district, he noticed a man in a dark coat watching him from across the street. Their eyes met briefly before the man turned away. Gabriel's heart thudded, but he said nothing to Maria. He didn't want to worry her. Then, a week later, the knock came. It was early, just after sunrise. 3 uniformed officers stood at the door, stern-faced and cold. "Gabriel Alvarez?" one of them asked. He nodded. "You're under arrest for the assault of a minor," the officer said without emotion. Gabriel's mouth went dry. "What? I know that's a mistake. I helped him. I didn't." His voice cracked, drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. Maria screamed, "This is wrong. He's innocent." But the officers didn't flinch. Neighbors peeked from their windows as Gabriel was led down the narrow street, like a criminal. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. Confusion, fear, and disbelief coiled around him like chains. At the police station, Gabriel sat in a cold, gray interrogation room. The officer across from him flipped through a file. "Witnesses say you attacked 2 boys near the market," he said flatly. Gabriel's eyes widened. "I stopped them from hurting another boy. That's all. You can ask. The boy says you grabbed him, pushed him against the wall." The officer interrupted. "He has bruises. There's CCTV footage of a struggle." Gabriel's voice dropped to a whisper. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But it was. The holding cell was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Gabriel sat on the metal bench with his head in his hands, feeling as though the world had slipped out from beneath his feet. The flickering light above him buzzed like an insect in his ear, and each echoing footstep in the corridor reminded him he was not free anymore. He was not Gabriel, the husband, the handyman, the quiet protector of small children in alleyways. No, in their eyes, he was now Gabriel the accused, the dangerous man, the case file, the misjudged. Hours passed without a word. When they finally allowed him a call, his fingers trembled as he dialed Maria's number. The line clicked, and her voice cracked through, thick with emotion. "Gabriel, I didn't do anything, Maria," he said, his voice hoarse. "I swear to you, I only helped that boy. They twisted it all." "I know," she whispered. "I know who you are. But Gabriel, they've already started saying things. The neighbors, people at work. Even the landlord came by asking questions." Gabriel's throat tightened. "Do you believe me?" "I've never stopped," she replied. "But I don't know how we fight this." The silence that followed was heavier than any iron gate. Days turned into weeks. Gabriel was granted bail, but the bond was too high. Maria scraped together what she could, sold her necklace, pawned their radio, begged an old friend for help. But it wasn't enough. So Gabriel stayed locked up in the city jail, awaiting trial. Maria visited when she could. Her eyes always had that same red rim, as though she cried more than she slept. She brought clothes, a book, and letters, pages filled with encouragement, Bible verses, and reassurances. "This is just a storm," she wrote, "and storms don't last." But even storms leave destruction in their wake. Gabriel began to fade, not just in spirit, but in presence. The other men in the jail rarely spoke to him. He kept his head down, ate in silence, prayed quietly. Yet each night, when the metal doors clanked shut and the lights dimmed, he would stare at the ceiling and whisper, "Why, Lord? Why now? Why me?" He was not a perfect man. He had known anger, fear, and failure, but he had never raised his hand in cruelty, never stolen, never lied to hurt another. All he wanted was a decent life with Maria, a simple home, a future, maybe children someday. But now, every dream felt as fragile as a dying flame in the wind. The first court hearing arrived like a wave crashing into rock. Gabriel stood in the defendant's box, his hands clenched tightly together. The boy who had falsely accused him sat in the courtroom, flanked by adults, solemn and unreadable. The prosecutor spoke with confidence, painting a picture of a dangerous man who had snapped in a moment of rage. Gabriel's lawyer, a tired man assigned by the court, barely argued. "We'll wait for the next session," he said afterward, avoiding Gabriel's eyes. Maria sat in the back row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When their eyes met, Gabriel saw both love and helplessness in her face. It broke him more than any cell could. After the hearing, Maria met him briefly outside the courtroom. "We'll appeal," she said. "I'll talk to someone. I'll find help." Gabriel wanted to believe her, but even hope felt far now, like a memory of warmth in the dead of winter. Back in his cell, Gabriel sat on the edge of his bed, watching the sky darken through the small barred window. Somewhere, out beyond the concrete walls, his life was slipping away. He reached into the pocket of his prison shirt and pulled out the small folded paper Maria had given him. On it was a single sentence: "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34, verse 18. He closed his eyes and whispered again, "If you see me, God, if you really see me, please don't let this be the end." No reply came, only the distant sound of chains clinking and doors slamming. But in that cold silence, Gabriel held on to the faintest whisper of faith, like the last ember in a dying fire. The passing days turned into months. The concrete walls that once felt foreign became familiar, and yet they never softened. Gabriel no longer counted the days. Time blurred into a slow-moving fog. Each morning was a repetition of the last. Wake up, pray silently, eat without taste, listen to guards shouting names, and wait for the next echoing footstep that never seemed meant for him. His cellmate, an older man named Louis, was serving time for theft. Louis didn't talk much, but he would sometimes hold him in the dark. Gabriel found those moments oddly comforting. It reminded him of the evenings Maria used to sing softly in the kitchen, humming along as she washed dishes, sometimes even singing to the cat they never officially owned but always fed. That warmth felt so far away now, like a life he had only dreamt of once and could barely remember. Letters from Maria stopped coming. At first, he thought it was a mail delay. Then perhaps she had gotten sick. Then maybe she gave up. Gabriel tried not to let his mind go there, but the silence hurt more than any verdict could. He replayed every conversation they ever had, trying to find where he had failed, where he had lost her. Had he asked too much? Was the burden of his situation too great? Or had the world simply convinced her he was guilty? Every evening, he sat on the edge of his cot and opened the now wrinkled verse she had once given him. The ink was fading, but the message still burned. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. But what if even the Lord had turned his face? One night, after a particularly harsh argument between two inmates down the hall, Gabriel sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling through the shadows. Faint moonlight spilled into the narrow window, casting a pale line across the floor. That line of light was the only beautiful thing in the cell. He whispered aloud, voice hoarse, "I did everything right. I lived quietly. I stayed honest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't hurt anyone. And I saved that boy." His throat caught. Why am I here? No answer came. He felt the tears come uninvited, slow and bitter. He hadn't cried in weeks, maybe months, maybe since the day of the trial. But now they came like a flood, a deep weeping, not of fear, but complete abandonment. He felt utterly unseen, forgotten by the justice system, forgotten by Maria, forgotten even by God, until suddenly he wasn't. It wasn't a sound he heard. It was a feeling, a shift in the air, as though something holy had stepped into the room, unseen but very present. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, like someone sitting beside you in silence, just to let you know you're not alone. Gabriel sat up, breath held, looking around the cell. There was nothing, no light, no vision, no thunder, just a deep, still peace. And in the silence, a sentence formed in his heart. Not a voice, not in the way one hears through ears, but something real nonetheless. "I see you." He gasped, his hands trembling. Was that? But the sensation faded. Was he imagining it? Was it desperation? Hallucination? Or was it him? He didn't know. But for the first time in months, Gabriel slept with calm in his chest. The next day, a letter arrived. It was from Maria. It was short, only a few lines. "I'm sorry for the silence. Things have been hard, but I haven't forgotten you. I spoke with a new attorney. He says your case shouldn't have gone to trial. He's going to help us. Don't give up." Gabriel stared at the words, rereading them over and over. Something inside him stirred, a tiny ember of hope trying to reignite. He folded the letter slowly, pressing it close to the psalm verse, and held them both near his heart. Was it coincidence? Or was it the beginning of something divine? The clang of the metal door echoed like a final sentence through the cold stone hallway, each reverberation cutting deeper into Gabriel's heart. As he stepped inside the narrow cell that would now define his world, everything around him felt as though it had been drained of color, drained of time, drained of mercy. The walls, stained with memories of other forgotten souls, seemed to close in with each breath he took. The small iron bed creaked beneath him as he sat, and for a long moment he just stared at the floor, unable to believe this was real, that this was his life now. The air inside was thick with the scent of despair and rust. Every distant scream, every slamming gate, every order barked by guards carried with it the weight of broken men. Gabriel had imagined many versions of what prison might be like, but none had captured the feeling of being erased. That was the truest pain. He didn't feel punished, he felt erased. Maria's face flashed through his mind, her soft smile, the warmth of her hand in his. The quiet evenings filled with dreams they could barely afford to hold on to. Now, even those memories felt distant, like light from a dying star barely reaching him across the cold cosmos of his reality. Time lost meaning in the cell. Minutes bled into hours, hours into an eternal dusk. There were no clocks. The only markers of the day were the dull thud of boots at meal times and the flicker of overhead fluorescent lights. Gabriel barely touched his food. He wasn't hungry. Hunger seemed like a luxury compared to the weight pressing down on his soul. The isolation was like a mirror, one that forced him to see every flaw, every doubt, every fear. He had no visitors, no letters, no lawyer updates. It was as if the world had turned its back on him entirely, and maybe it had. At night, when silence settled like a thick fog over the facility, Gabriel would lie on his side and stare at the tiny barred window high above his bed. It offered no view, just a sliver of sky occasionally blackened by clouds. But he stared anyway, hoping for something. A star, a bird, anything that reminded him the world still existed beyond these walls. Sometimes he whispered to Maria, as if she could hear him. He told her he missed her, that he hadn't given up, that he still believed in something, even if he didn't know what it was anymore. The other inmates rarely spoke to him. He was a new one, the quiet one, the one who didn't belong. They called him priest mockingly, because he refused to swear and always kept his head bowed. What they didn't know was that Gabriel wasn't praying. Not really. He just didn't want him to see his eyes, didn't want him to witness the sadness there, or worse, the hope. Hope was dangerous here. It made you soft. It made you a target. One evening, while sitting on the cold concrete floor, Gabriel heard a faint song echoing through the vent above his bed. It was off-key, a broken melody hummed by someone down the hall, but it stirred something inside him. It reminded him of the hymns his mother used to hum while doing the laundry, back when life was simpler, when God still felt close. The sound didn't last long, but it was enough to make Gabriel close his eyes and, the first time in days, whisper a prayer, not a request, not a plea, just a whisper. Are you still there? There was no answer, no sign. The silence returned, pressing in thicker than before. But something in Gabriel shifted. He sat up straighter that night. He washed his face with cold water. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror and saw a man, tired, yes, but not broken. Not yet. In the following days, Gabriel began to take small steps to keep his mind from unraveling. He cleaned his cell, folded his sheets, read the worn Bible left on the shelf. Not because he believed it would change anything, but because the rhythm of reading gave his thoughts a home. He began to write letters to Maria in his mind, replaying conversations, imagining her responses. These were his anchor. But the hardest moments were always the nights. That was when the cold bit deepest, when the memories haunted loudest, when he remembered the trial and the faces of people who never once believed his innocence. He had spoken the truth, but in a courtroom full of doubt, the truth had sounded like a lie. And that truth, his truth, now lived in a place where truth didn't matter. Still, in the quiet, in the stillness, Gabriel clung to something he couldn't name. Was it faith? Was it stubbornness? Or was it simply that he couldn't bear to become what this place wanted him to be? Silent, forgotten, resigned? And so he endured, day by day, breath by breath. He had cried his tears. Now he waited, not for rescue, not for justice. He waited for a voice. Any voice. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Inside the cold belly of the prison, the seasons blurred. Gabriel lost track of what month it was, what holidays were passing, and even how old he was becoming. The passage of time felt like erosion, subtle but steady, wearing down everything he once was. He had memorized the number of cracks in his wall, the distant timing of the guard steps, and even the rhythm of the flickering ceiling light outside his cell. It was a strange or a survival, this habit of mapping misery. But even in the monotony, there were moments, brief, fragile, that hinted something sacred still stirred deep within him. One evening, as the rest of the inmates were dragged into a shouting match over cards and cold food, Gabriel remained on his cot, staring at the Bible again, not reading, just holding it, feeling its worn weight in his hands. He hadn't opened it for days, not since his last letter prayer to Maria in his mind. But something made his fingers drift over the edges, and eventually he opened it. The page fell to the Gospel of Matthew. His eyes scanned a verse he had long forgotten. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Gabriel blinked. For a moment, the noise of the prison faded into the background. He could hear his own breathing. The words echoed in his chest. He wasn't even sure why that verse hit so hard. It wasn't new to him. But this time it felt different, like it was whispered to him, not from the page, but from somewhere deeper. He clutched the book and whispered, "Are you still there?" No thunder, no blinding light, just silence and a stillness so vast, so quiet that it felt holy. Later that week, Gabriel was assigned to kitchen duty, washing trays and scrubbing crusted pots alongside a man named Reggie. Reggie was loud, rough, tattooed from neck to knuckle, and spent most of his time cursing everything that moved. But oddly enough, he never cursed Gabriel. "You're too quiet to hate," he once grumbled. That was as close to respect as anyone gave in there. One day, after hours of silence, Reggie leaned in and asked, "You pray, man?" Gabriel hesitated. "Sometimes." "Waste of breath," Reggie said, tossing a tray into the sink. "Ain't no God in here." Gabriel didn't argue. He just continued scrubbing. But that night, as he returned to his cell with aching arms and a sore back, he did pray, not out loud, just within. His prayer was simple. "If you are still with me, please don't let me disappear." The loneliness clawed at him more than ever. His letters to Maria, the imaginary ones, became more desperate. He replayed every memory. How she used to trace circles on his hand when they sat in silence. How she always hummed when she cooked, even if there was nothing in the fridge but bread and hope. He missed her with a hunger that gnawed at his ribs. But worse than the missing was the doubt. What if she had truly moved on? What if she believed the charges? He hadn't heard from her. Not once. No visit. No letter. No whisper of her name in the guard's daily list. And yet, he couldn't stop loving her, couldn't stop hoping. One night, when the prison was unusually quiet and the moon cast a pale light through the barred window, Gabriel dreamed. In his dream, he was back at home, barefoot on cracked kitchen tiles, Maria standing at the stove. She turned to him with a smile, but her eyes were full of tears. "I tried," she said. "I tried to wait." He reached for her, but before he could touch her, the floor crumbled beneath him and he fell. Down into darkness. As he fell, he heard a voice, not Maria's, not his own, but something vast and ancient in kind. "You are not forgotten." He woke with tears soaking his pillow. Was it just a dream? His mind, desperate for comfort, inventing voices and visions? Or was someone truly there? The morning after the dream, something in Gabriel shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no voices, no visions, no miracles when he opened his eyes. But his breath felt a little less heavy, his heart a little less hollow. That one sentence, "You are not forgotten," echoed through him with a strange strength, like a thread he could hold on to in a sea determined to drown him. For the first time in months, he made his bed neatly, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to. He ran his fingers across the pages of the Bible, not aimlessly but with intention, as if he were searching for something, anything, that could explain the whisper in his dream. Days passed, still no letters, still no visits, still no word from Maria. But instead of despair, he found himself thinking, what if she's praying too? What if she hasn't given up on me? And more importantly, what if he really is listening? The prison didn't change, of course. It remained cruel and unrelenting. One afternoon, a fight broke out during yard time. Gabriel wasn't involved, but he got caught in the wave of chaos. A guard shoved him to ground, knee pressing into his back as fists flew nearby. Dirt filled his mouth. His lips split open on the concrete. Back in his cell, bruised and aching, Gabriel sat in the corner and pressed his fingers to the cut on his mouth. He didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, he whispered, "You said I'm not forgotten, so I'm trusting you." His cellmate, an older man named Louis who rarely spoke, watched from a bunk. "You talking to God again?" Louis muttered. Gabriel nodded. "Yeah." Louis grunted. "He answer you yet?" Gabriel looked up, his face steady. "I think he already did." That night, something remarkable happened. Not outside. No doors opened, no angels descended. But within Gabriel, he picked up the Bible and began writing in the margins. Not sermons, not reflections, just pieces of himself. Thoughts, questions, pain, hope. It was as if the pages had become a conversation. "If you are with me, please help me forgive. Not them, me." He wrote it over and over again. Forgiveness. That word clung to him like a coat too heavy to wear. Could he forgive the people who accused him? The system that forgot him? Even Maria, if she had truly left? In the weeks that followed, Gabriel began to change in subtle ways. He listened more. He offered up his food when someone else was hungry. When Reggie got thrown into isolation, Gabriel left behind a folded napkin with a scripture verse in it. When Louis had a panic attack in the middle of the night, Gabriel held his hand until it passed. "You a preacher or something?" Louis asked him one morning. "No," Gabriel said. "I'm just trying not to drown." One day, while sweeping the hallway, a chaplain passed by and paused at Gabriel. "You're the one who leaves scripture notes in the lunch trays?" Gabriel looked down, embarrassed. "Yeah." The chaplain smiled. "Keep doing it. Someone needs it more than you know." Gabriel watched the man walk away and felt a warmth rise in his chest. Not pride, not joy, something deeper. Like he was finally beginning to remember who he really was. Beneath the shame, beneath the silence, beneath the prison walls. He wasn't free yet, not by a long shot, but he was changing. And he knew, deep in his bones, that change wasn't coming from him. It was being stirred in him. The season began to shift. Cold air drifted through the narrow windows of the prison. Frost crept into every corner, and Gabriel's breath hung in the air like smoke each morning. Winter, with all its silence and stillness, had come. And with it came something Gabriel hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. There was no more anger left in him. Not the seething fury that once clawed at his insides when the verdict was read. Not the bitterness that poisoned his sleep in the early months. What remained now was something quieter. A tired kind of peace. The kind you find after surrender. Every morning, Gabriel sat on the edge of his cot, whispering prayers that weren't desperate demands anymore but small offerings. Thank you for keeping me breathing. Thank you for another sunrise, even if I can't see it. He had stopped asking for freedom. He wasn't done hoping for it, but he had given up on wrestling for control. Instead, he started focusing on being useful to the broken world around him. When new inmates arrived, young, angry, trembling, Gabriel was often the one the guards assigned to orient them. He would guide them through the chaos of prison life, not with rules, but with quiet presence, a steady voice, a kind gesture. He wasn't the loudest or the toughest, but he had something the others recognized. Peace in a place meant to destroy peace. One day, a young man named Darius arrived, barely 20, wild eyes, shaky hands. Gabriel saw himself in him. The first night, Darius didn't sleep. He paced, muttered to himself. At one point, he slammed his fist against the wall until his knuckles bled. Gabriel didn't say much. He just gave him a towel, a bottle of water, and sat near him. The next day, Darius asked, "Why do you care?" Gabriel answered without hesitation, "Because someone's watching, and he cares." Darius stared at him. "Who? You got people on the outside?" Gabriel smiled faintly. "Not out there. Above." That night, Gabriel wrote again in the margins of his Bible, "Even if the world forgets me, I believe you won't." But doubt still lingered like shadows around his feet. In the dark hours before dawn, Gabriel woke from a dream unlike any other. He was standing in a field, vast and open. Snow fell gently, but he wasn't cold. A fire burned in the distance, and by it stood a man, robed in white, his face radiant like sunrise. The man didn't speak, but raised his hand, and suddenly the warmth spread through Gabriel's chest like a flood. Then he spoke, not aloud, but into Gabriel's very soul. "I see you, and I have never left you." Gabriel gasped as he woke, drenched in sweat, tears spilling down his cheeks. Was it real? He touched his chest, half expecting to feel warmth still there. Lewis stirred on the upper bunk. "You all right?" Gabriel nodded, breathless. Yeah, just a dream." But it wasn't just a dream. Not this time. Something had broken open in him. He rose, felt his knees on the cold concrete floor, and whispered, "Jesus, if that was you, thank you. I don't need anything else. Just stay with me." For the rest of that night, he didn't sleep. He didn't need to. The prison chapel was often empty. A small, forgotten room near the eastern wing, lined with cracked wooden pews and a dusty altar no one had touched in years. It was cold in there, colder than the cells, but Gabriel found himself drawn to it after the dream, as if something sacred still lingered between those silent walls. He went there every morning now, at first just to sit. No grand declarations, no dramatic prayers, just silence. He would close his eyes and breathe, his hands resting on the worn Bible that had become his anchor. He didn't need to understand everything anymore. The questions that once haunted him, why me, why now, had faded into something softer. In their place grew a quiet trust. He began to write letters in the back of his Bible, not to people, but to God himself. Today, I watched the snow fall through the window in the laundry room. It reminded me of when Maria and I first moved into our old apartment. She used to light a candle every time it snowed, said it made the cold feel warmer. I never told her how much I loved that. And later, Darius finally slept through the night. I think he's starting to believe there's more to life than rage. Thank you for giving me something to give him. Gabriel didn't see it, but something was changing around him. The guards who once ignored him now nodded as he passed. Inmates who once mocked him now sought him out in the yard, asking questions they were too afraid to ask anyone else. "Do you really believe he listens?" one asked. Gabriel had paused, looking up at the gray sky beyond the razor wire. "I don't just believe it," he said slowly. "I've felt it when no one else was there. He was." The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't even intended to be spoken aloud. But they came from a place deeper than reason. A well inside his soul that had been filled drop by drop through every tear, every prayer, every silent night on the floor. One afternoon, while helping clean the chapel, he found something wedged beneath the pulpit, a small wooden cross. Broken, its base snapped. It must have been discarded years ago. Gabriel held it in his hands for a long while. Then he set it upright on the altar, propping it carefully with folded paper. "It's still standing," he whispered. That night, as he returned to his cell, something felt different in the air. The hallway lights flickered as usual. The steel bars groaned. The distant arguments echoed from the other wing. And yet, there was something else. A stillness. A presence. He closed the cell door behind him and sat on his cot, eyes closed, hands clasped. He didn't pray for release anymore. He prayed for strength to serve, for eyes to see others as he did, for ears that could still hear the quiet voice that had whispered in his dream, "I have never left you." That voice had awakened something inside him that prison could not chain. And for the first time in years, Gabriel allowed himself to weep, not out of sorrow, but out of reverence, out of gratitude, out of the unshakable certainty that he was no longer forgotten, that his silence had never been empty. It had been heard, and that voice from heaven was closer than ever. Gabriel couldn't sleep that night. The air in his cell was heavy, but it wasn't the usual weight of confinement or cold. It was different, like the hush before a storm. But instead of dread, he felt a reverent stillness, a sacred anticipation pressing against his chest. He lay there in silence, the rusted bunk creaking beneath him, eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. The chipped concrete above seemed almost to shimmer faintly in the darkness, and though he tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, something inside him whispered otherwise. The next morning, Gabriel went back to the chapel before the guards even called for breakfast. The door was already open. That was the first sign. The chapel was always locked overnight. He knew this. The keys hung behind the station guard's desk, and no one ever left them unattended. And yet, the door creaked on its hinges as he stepped inside. The scent of dust and old wood filled his nose, grounding him in the moment. As he walked toward the altar, his foot brushed against something on the ground. A white feather, clean, bright, untouched by the grime that clung to every surface of the prison. He bent down, fingers trembling, and picked it up slowly. A chill moved through his spine, not fear, but awe. He sat at the front pew, clutching the feather, and began to weep without reason, not out of sadness or despair, but something else, something deeper, a kind of release his soul hadn't known it needed. And in the stillness, a warmth settled over him like a blanket. He closed his eyes and felt it, not with his skin, but with his spirit, a presence, near, gentle, the kind of closeness he remembered from childhood, when his mother would kneel beside his bed and pray softly until he fell asleep. But this was more powerful, wiser, eternal. He couldn't see anyone, but he didn't need to, because the room was full of something holy. A voice, so soft, it didn't come through the ears, but through the marrow of his bones, spoke just 3 words. "I am here." Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. He gripped the pew in front of him, eyes wide and heart pounding, not from fear, but from the overwhelming certainty that what he had longed for, cried for, waited for in silence had come. He whispered, "Jesus?" No reply came in words, but suddenly he was flooded with memory, not random flashes, but curated moments from his life. Maria laughing with flour on her nose, their baby's first cry echoing in the hospital room, the time he almost gave up but pushed forward because of one simple prayer, and then the courtroom, the sentence, the cold cuffs on his wrists, the nights he asked, "Why?" But this time, he saw it all differently. The same scenes played back, but now he noticed something he'd never seen before. In every frame, he was not alone. There was always light, a flicker, a warmth, a shadow of a hand resting on his shoulder. He had missed it because his eyes were looking outward, not upward. Gabriel sank to his knees in the chapel, arms stretched over the wooden bench, and sobbed until he couldn't breathe. He wasn't praying for freedom anymore. He wasn't begging for vindication. He was just crying because he had finally seen the truth. He had been carried the whole way. Every moment of hopelessness, every tear on the prison floor, every night he thought God had abandoned him. Jesus was there, quiet, patient, present, not as a distant figure in the sky, but as a companion in the dirt. The feather lay on the floor beside him, untouched by the dust. When he rose from prayer, he took it with him and placed it in the back of his Bible next to the letters he had written. He no longer needed to ask if his prayers had reached heaven, because heaven had come to him. The morning after Gabriel's experience in the chapel, the prison looked exactly the same, but he didn't feel the same. The walls still stood tall and gray. The meals were still bland and meager, the routine still rigid and punishing. But something inside him had shifted. It was not dramatic or theatrical, like chains breaking open or doors swinging wide. It was quieter, like a whisper in a storm, like peace sneaking into the cracks of a fortress. He walked back to his cell with the feather tucked carefully inside the pages of his Bible. He no longer felt that gnawing ache in his chest, not because anything had changed outside, but because something eternal had been planted inside. As the hours passed, Gabriel sat on his thin mattress, staring out through the narrow window slit. He could barely see the sky from where he sat, just a sliver of gray or blue, depending on the weather. But today, that tiny sliver seemed like a portal. It reminded him of Maria's eyes, how they used to reflect the sky when they laughed together on their porch years ago. He hadn't seen her face in so long, but the memory came alive again with vivid clarity. He whispered her name, Maria, just once. It felt like letting go of a breath he'd been holding for years. The guards passed by, indifferent as always. One of them glanced into his cell, expecting the usual blank stare or silent resentment. Instead, Gabriel looked up and gave him a small nod. It wasn't forced. It was genuine. The guard paused for half a second, surprised, then moved on. That simple act of recognition, of seeing and being seen, planted a new kind of seed in Gabriel's heart. Even in a place where dignity was stripped away, he realized he still had the power to choose compassion. He still had the power to reflect the light he had encountered. Later that day, he was escorted to the warden's office. This was unusual. Gabriel hadn't caused any trouble. He hadn't filed a complaint or made any requests. As he walked to the corridor, escorted by two officers, he whispered a silent prayer, not asking for anything, just thanking God for being present in his life again. The warden sat behind a large desk, his expression unreadable. Gabriel stood silently, hand behind his back, his posture calm but alert. The warden slid a document across the table. "You've got a visitor," he said flatly. "Your lawyer, a new one." Gabriel's brow furrowed. I didn't request one." The warden shrugged. "He asked for you." Gabriel sat across from the man minutes later in the small visitation room. The lawyer was younger than he expected, with a worn leather briefcase and kind eyes. "My name is Nathaniel," he said, shaking Gabriel's hand. "I've been reviewing your case. Something didn't sit right with me." Gabriel's heart thudded. "Why would you take my case? I can't afford legal help." Nathaniel opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "Because sometimes justice needs an extra push. And because I believe in redemption." The word echoed in Gabriel's mind. Redemption. For years, it had seemed like a word reserved for other men, for men who had choices, who had control. But now it felt personal, alive. Nathaniel leaned forward, voice soft. "Someone anonymously submitted documents to my firm. Evidence. Things that weren't presented in your trial. Witness statements. Footage. Enough to cast serious doubt." Gabriel sat back, breathless. "I prayed," he whispered. "I didn't know how, not anymore, but I prayed." Nathaniel smiled. "Then maybe your prayers were heard." As the conversation continued, Gabriel felt something new rise inside him. Not hope born from desperation, but from assurance, from faith. That night, In his cell, he opened his Bible again. The feather still lay inside. His fingers brushed over it, then traced the verse Nathanael had read aloud before leaving. "The Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." He read it aloud, his voice trembling. He is near to the brokenhearted, and for the first time in years, Gabriel slept without waking up in fear. The days that followed moved differently for Gabriel. Time, once a merciless enemy that dragged itself in slow, agonizing loops, now had a strange rhythm. It was still slow, yes, but it wasn't hollow anymore. Each hour held meaning. Each morning he woke with a sense of anticipation. Not of the courts or verdicts, but of something deeper, a quiet unfolding of destiny. He began to notice things others overlooked. The way a beam of light danced across the cell wall just before noon. The faint scent of dust and paper when he opened his Bible. The quiet hum of life, even in a place built to strip it away. Nathanael returned twice that week, each time with more documents, more discoveries. There were transcripts, missing pages from witness testimonies, contradictory statements from key figures in the original case, and security camera footage that had never been submitted. Gabriel read each piece with trembling hands. He wasn't a lawyer. He couldn't decipher every detail. But what he did recognize was truth, peeking through cracks and injustice. "I don't want to get my hopes up," Gabriel admitted during one of their sessions, voice barely above a whisper. Nathanael looked him in the eye. "You don't have to. Just keep your faith strong. I'll carry the rest." Gabriel smiled faintly. It was the first time in years someone had offered to carry something for him, not physically, but spiritually. For so long, he had borne the crushing weight of abandonment, betrayal, and forgotten identity. But now he wasn't alone. His prayer had reached somewhere far beyond these walls, and someone had answered. As the legal process inched forward, word of Gabriel's case began to spread. Nathanael's firm, though small, had connections. Journalists took notice. Advocates for prison reform and wrongful convictions became interested. A quiet storm began to brew beyond the prison walls. Gabriel couldn't see it, but he could feel it, like pressure building in the heavens before the rain. One night, as he knelt beside his bunk, he felt an overwhelming urge to pray again, not for himself, but for Maria. He hadn't seen her in years. The last time they spoke was a bitter phone call after conviction, her voice trembling with disbelief and betrayal. She had hung up without saying goodbye. He couldn't blame her. The system had shattered their life, and she had no reason to believe he was innocent. But tonight, as he whispered her name into the silence, he didn't carry anger, only longing. "Lord, if there's still space for grace between us, let her find peace. Whether or not she ever finds me again, heal her." The next morning brought unexpected news. A letter. It was a small envelope, plain and unmarked, slipped beneath the cell door. Gabriel's heart pounded as he picked it up. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. He had memorized it from years of grocery lists and notes pinned to their fridge. Maria. His hands shook as he unfolded the page. It wasn't long. "Gabriel, I don't know why I'm writing. Maybe it's the way I couldn't sleep last night. Maybe it's something else. I saw your name in a news headline. I didn't even mean to, but there it was. For years I've carried a stone in my chest, anger, disappointment, sorrow. But I read about your case. I read what they're saying now, and I realized I never asked you what happened. I just believed the verdict. I don't know where this will lead. I don't know if you'll even get this. But I needed to say it. I'm sorry. Maria." Tears blurred the page. Gabriel pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes. He didn't know how long he sat like that, but it felt like time had folded in on itself. The past, the pain, the years, all melted into that single moment. Forgiveness, not as a gesture, but as a resurrection. He stood, walked to the window slit, and held the letter toward the light. Even in the smallest cracks, the light finds a way in. The day began like every other in prison. Dim lights humming overhead, guard exchanging tired greetings, footsteps echoing in the corridors. But something was different in Gabriel, something unshakable. He rose from his bed not with heaviness, but with purpose. The letter from Maria lay folded under his pillow like a sacred token. It had become a symbol, not just a reconciliation, but of restoration. For years, he had begged God not only to prove his innocence, but to simply be remembered. And now, in the silence that once broke him, he had become remembered by heaven and earth alike. Nathanael arrived just before noon, his face unreadable. He sat across from Gabriel behind a thick pane of reinforced glass, the receiver trembling slightly in his hand. Then he said only 2 words. "It's over." Gabriel blinked. "What do you mean?" "The court has officially dropped the charges. The new evidence was overwhelming. You're a free man, Gabriel. You're going home." Silence. Then the weight of years collapsed inside him. Gabriel couldn't speak. His lips quivered, his eyes widened, and then he wept. But it wasn't the hopeless, broken weeping of years past. It was different, like a storm breaking into sunlight. For the first time in over a decade, he wept not because he was lost, but because he had been found. That evening, as the sun bled gold through the narrow window of his cell, Gabriel sat alone one last time. He looked around at the space that had held both his nightmares and his prayers. The walls that had once seemed to close in on him now looked like they were bowing, yielding to something greater. He closed his eyes and whispered the same words he had spoken for so many nights. "Jesus, thank you for never leaving me." He was released the following morning. As he stepped out into the world, the sunlight almost blinded him. It was brighter than he remembered. The air tasted sharper. The sky stretched endlessly above him, not like a ceiling, but like a calling. Maria was waiting at the gate. Her hair had more gray. Her eyes held more weight. But when they met his gaze, something in her face broke open. She ran to him. No words, just a fierce, silent embrace. The kind only 2 people who had died and come back to life could share. Weeks passed. Gabriel began to rebuild, not just his life, but his soul. He spent his days in quiet reflection, long walks, and slow mornings filled with coffee and scripture. He and Maria sat on the porch often, not saying much, just being. The past could not be erased, but it had been redeemed. And yet one night, as Gabriel sat under a sky pierced with stars, he knew his story wasn't just for him. He had seen too much, lost too much, been saved by a voice when the world had gone quiet. That kind of grace wasn't meant to be kept in silence. He began to speak. At churches, shelters, prisons, wherever people gathered in darkness, Gabriel stood and told them about the God who walks in the prison cells, who sits with the forgotten, who speaks through silence. He told them about how, when he had nothing left, no name, no advocate, no hope, Jesus came, not in thunder or flame, but in quiet presence, in warmth when the nights were cold, in letters that should never have arrived, in the hands of a stranger who fought for him, in the forgiveness of a woman who once believed he was guilty. He ended every talk the same way. "They may have locked my body in a cage, but it was Jesus who freed my soul." Years later, when Gabriel was asked how he endured those long, bitter seasons, he would smile gently and reply, "I cried in silence, but heaven heard me." Because some prayers don't echo through the world. They rise straight into eternity. And when they do, Jesus answers.